Good morning. I'm very happy to introduce our speaker, Kevin Gibson, today. Here's what he shared with me for the introduction. He says, due to the lack of a trust fund, Kevin has been an infantry officer, tour guide, bus driver, mediator, and thoroughly amateur magician. Prior to retirement, he was a professor of management and philosophy at Marquette for 25 years. He's the author of 4 books and over 30 articles. He's been a member of First Church for 20 years. Kevin?
Thank you. Well, thank you, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for the committee for setting this up. I'm really privileged to be here. I planned for about 35 minutes. We'll see how it goes. There is some audience participation. I do warn you that I'm a bit like a Harry Potter dementor in that I suck the life and joy out of electronics. So we'll see how this goes and we'll take it from there. First of all, I would be remiss if I did not note it is Mother's Day, so happy Mother's Day to all the mothers online and in the room. So one of the UU principles is that we need to search for truth and meaning. And what I would like us to do today is to be self-reflective. I've got why don't you think like me? It's probably better put as why don't I think like you? What is a barrier to the way that we exchange information and ideas? So that's where I'll be going with this. Most of these I'm trying to dig out. Some will be obvious, but also some we're just not aware of. So I'm going to use some social science to see if we can identify some of those. So my goals, I'm looking at several ways that we may be irrational or sidetracked. I'm going to give you some findings, and I have been accused occasionally of being either astral or stuck in the weeds. So I'll go fairly quickly on this and skim the surface. So I'm going to look at 3 elements. I'll just divide the talk into 3. One is about perceptions and cognitive abilities. The other is semantic, how we use words. And the third one is about context and framing. It's a bit of a fire hose, hence the power pub there. I'm just going to throw a lot at you. There will be a little time for questions afterwards, but I think given the nature of this, what I would like to do is present the material and then we'll have time for questions afterwards. Okay, I'd like you just to look at that screen for a moment or two. George, this is where you're going to be put on the spot. So George, could you read the triangle on the left, please?
Paris in the spring, and the spring.
Well done. Most people will look at this and say Paris in the spring, once in a lifetime, a bird in the hand. Because of the way it's structured, your brain automatically goes to Paris in the spring. It will not see the extra "the" embedded in there. If you want a party trick, try this. Just take it home. About 9 out of 10 people will not see the extra word embedded in there. Now, when I was an undergraduate, the exemplar of thinking was this thing called the rational man. And the rational man followed the ideas to their natural conclusion. First of all, man is not necessarily the ideal here. It used to be that man was mind, cerebral, women were emotional and didn't think clearly. That has all gone out the window. Plus, rationality is imbued with emotions, influences, So we no longer look just to rational thought. It's complicated. So, cognitive issues. This is really my final slide, so I'll just read this one too. This is the take home. Human minds are ill-equipped to deal with uncertainty. You get deluged with so much stimuli every day that you can't cope with it and you need to make shortcuts. Those shortcuts represent your experience and you're looking at things and you've done this before. So we can't cope with every bit of information. We tend to take these little shortcuts. We often perceive what we expect to perceive, which is what I just did with you. Once you have formed your opinions, you tend to be invested in your opinions. So if I said something like, which is further London to Madrid or Paris to Berlin, who knows? You take up a position, but once you've made that decision, you actually get invested in that. And we often seek out confirming rather than counter evidence. Okay. So next, can we see two things at once? Well, we can see two things. Here is a Dalmatian. Head, legs, body. And on the other side we have a cube, and the question is, which is the front side? This side or this side? So you can see that we see things from two different ways. The problem is we can't see them at the same time. You can flick between them, but you can't hold those two views at the same time. I'll see if I can get this to work. Bear with me. I really want to skip that. Let's have a Okay, I'll spend a minute and a half on this one. So as the mask rotates, when it rotates, although it is concave, you cannot see that. Your mind forces you to see it as both sticking out. So the mask rotates, there's the outside. As it rotates, this is the inside. But your brain will not allow you to see that as indented.
Wow.
The point of this being that your brain cannot interpret confusing information. You want to make sense of it, and it forces you to see the inside of that. We'll do it one more rotation. Yeah. Bear with me. Okay. Let me refer you to the 1986 shuttle disaster. I can't do this with undergraduates anymore because they're all 18 to 20-year-olds. Yeah. Does anyone remember what the cause of the disaster was?
O-ring.
O-rings, yeah.
Okay. Here is Richard Feynman at the inquiry, famous scientist. What he did was get an O-ring, get a bucket of iced water, put the O-ring in the iced water, and it became brittle and he just snapped it. The reason I bring this up is that our minds like to have single causes. And in fact, what was going on is a lot more complicated. Yes, the O-rings were a factor. There were engineering problems, and that would be the O-ring. But if you remember the culture that was going on, we had they were supposed to do the shuttle once every 2 weeks originally. And this was repeatedly delayed. So what we get at NASA is a culture which is going, push, let's do it. They're all sort of military. Let's do this. Let's get on with the job. There was the political backdrop of the teacher in space. And then who was the individual who was saying go? Who pushed the button?
Ronald Reagan.
Sorry?
Ronald Reagan.
As it turned out, they tended to blame an individual at NASA, Malloy, who said, I think it's good to go. The famous phrase is, take off your engineering hat and put on your management hat. Yeah. So although we say O-rings, and that's the thing that we have embedded in our minds, in fact, yes, there's a whole lot more going on. And so I'm just sort of stirring this up to say there's more to be said.
Hey, Kevin, could we ask you to speak as close to them?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I'm now going to go down to semantic issues, semantic words. And I'll give you a couple of examples. One goes by the technical term of amphibole, you don't need to know that, there's no test. And the other one is hypostatization, which is another lovely word that you don't need to know. Okay. Let me try and illustrate this. People use the word sustainability all over the place. I'm going to isolate two meanings for sustainability. There I am on the treadmill on the left. Thing about a treadmill, it gives you a certain pace. You have to keep going at that pace. That is, I need to sustain that pace. On the right, I've got the earth. And another meaning of sustainability is that we preserve the resources of the earth for future generations. And you can see that those two meanings are very, very different. So what we have is Exxon, on the one hand saying, let's keep pumping, let's keep the output as it is, as best we can, and at the same time they blend this notion saying, oh, we're going to look after people and the planet. But they're two very different notions of sustainability. So when you read that a corporation is sustainable, and they put that in their corporate report, it could just mean we're going to keep doing what we're doing. And that's how words tend to fuzz our thinking. I'll give you a couple more. Here's Captain Smith, who was on the Titanic. And it's easy to say that Captain Smith was responsible for the sinking of the Titanic. I just want to confuse you a little more by giving several meanings for responsible. He was a responsible person, he paid his taxes. He was a responsible seaman, he took all his exams, he did whatever you need to do. He was responsible, he was the one blamed for the actions that night. He was not having a fit, he was not delusional, he was actually responsible for his own actions that night. He was not responsible for the loss of the Titanic. We can go back to the O-rings, I mean, it's all the builders of the Titanic and the watch people and so on. He was held responsible at the Board of Inquiry, and then we can just say that the white star line is responsible. But this is by way of saying that the simple word responsible has a multitude of meanings, and it can easily confuse our thinking. I'll give you one more, that we ought to publicize things because they're in the public interest. Well, just because the public is interested in them does not mean they are in the public interest. Now, hyperstatization is a fun one. This is when we give standing to corporate entities. On the right there, your left, my right, is Delta Airlines. I have a chip on my shoulder about Delta Airlines because they messed me up last year, and I get a text saying, Delta is sorry for your inconvenience. Well, Delta is not responsible, Delta is not sorry for anything. What I really wanted was some individual to come to me and apologize for what they put me through. By saying the budget, it means we have to let you go. We are denying individual responsibility. We are just sweeping it under this corporate entity. Denny's, you may recall, had an incident with racial profiling where they charged African American customers before the meal and white customers after the meal. But you couldn't find anyone who was individually responsible. So the question is Denny's responsible in some way? And on the right there, I have the Exxon Valdez. And was the captain responsible for that? Should we boycott individual Exxon stations because of this remote happening in Alaska? So hyperstatization takes something abstract and makes it real. And then we start talking about this real entity, like nobody came in the room. Well, nobody is a non-thing. And it, again, befuddles our thinking. So we've got cognitive issues, we've got semantic issues. I'm going to spend a few minutes looking at framing effects. If I go to Sendix, and if I bring my own bag, they give me a 5-cent discount. However, what if I went to Sendix and they charged me 5 cents every time I didn't bring my own bag? Economically, it's the same thing. 5 cents gained, 5 cents lost. We will react a whole lot differently to being penalized than we will to getting a benefit. Technically, this is known as loss aversion. That is, if we think we're losing something, we're much more motivated by that than if we think that we're gaining something. So if I have a midweek discount at the movie theatre, that's not a big deal. If I get charged a premium at the weekend, I get sort of annoyed about that, even though it's economically the same thing. So the way that we frame these claims matters a whole lot. Imagine going to a doctor and they say, this procedure has a 90% survival rate. Fair enough. You could go to another doctor who said there's a 10% chance of you dying. Which one would you prefer? Same information framed in different ways. I made my career out of fancy titles. This is one of mine, egocentric martyrdom. This means that if something happens to me, it's much more important and significant than if it happens to you. So I've got on the beach, if 2 $10 bills floated along in the breeze and I found them, I'm much more likely to share them with a friend than if I lost 2 $10 bills. If he asked me to then compensate him, I'd be upset about that. Right? So we treat gains and losses very, very differently. So this turns out to actually be physical. Gains give you some pleasure, but losses stimulate this thing in your brain called the amygdala. It's the fight or flight syndrome. So if you perceive something as a loss, it actually makes a physical difference and motivates you a whole lot more. As an aside, and of course this is not political, but if you look at ads in the last few years, a negative ad will motivate people much, much more than a positive ad. Saying this way of being invaded is much more powerful than saying we all ought to unite and come together. Okay. Moving on to anchoring effects. I'll just go to the bottom. I think that cars ought to cost $20,000 because that's how much I paid the last time I bought a car. CDs at Goodwill cost $2. And what else have I got there? Car batteries ought to cost $80. I was a little shocked. These are the numbers that I have in my head of things, how much things ought to cost. So if a car salesman comes to me and said, this is the $100,000 car, but we'll give it to you for, 80, then they've anchored points in your brain and you're much more likely to think that you're getting a deal if they start much higher. So the numbers may themselves be arbitrary, but in fact, you're affected by the way it's presented. Couple of fun experiments. Subjects were asked to spin a roulette wheel and get a number. And those who got low numbers on the wheel were then asked to do an arithmetical estimate. Those with lower numbers selected lower numbers, lower estimates. If I asked you to write out your social security number and the last 2 digits of your social security number were low, again the same thing happened. If you've got lower numbers as you enter your social security, you are more likely then in a subsequent mathematical problem to give an estimate that's lower. Nothing personal, it's what we do, it's how our brains work. I want to give you a couple more examples. Many of you are familiar with the famous philosophical trolley problem. I'll just mention it to you. There's a runaway train full of high explosives. It's going to go off in a minute. You can divert the train, so it's heading towards 5 people. You could divert it to 1 person. What should you do? This is the famous trolley problem. Just to mess with it, you know, there could be pedophiles, there could be President Trump, any you could mess with the example in all sorts of ways. But I want to give you 2 ways in which this is not usually presented. One is, let's make it 1,000,001 versus 1,000,005. Or 10,000,001 versus 10,000,005. Does that alter your intuition about whether it should be 5 and 1, or does the number then mush together so it becomes insignificant? Certainly not insignificant to the people involved. So the first one was a proportion, 5 to 1, the second one's addition. Yeah. Let's talk about vaccinations. I'm just going to present a case where there is a disease and 6 out of 100,000 will die. And there's a vaccine which eliminates the disease, but 3 out of 100,000 will die of side effects. Which one would you do? This is a version of the trolley problem where instead of just diverting the switch, you're on a bridge with a rather large philosopher. If you nudge this rather large philosopher, he will fall onto the tracks and die, but everyone else will be saved. Does it make a difference? When you ask people, they're quite willing to flick the switch such that the one will die. If you actually have to push someone, people feel very, very differently. Why do I introduce this? Because in the case of vaccinations, we may be saving people, but we do not want to be the agents of harm. We do not want to be there's one thing to say, nature causes this. But if we feel that our decisions are actively killing people, it makes us much more reluctant. And seen from this view, the whole vaccination debate becomes a lot more understandable, because the sheer numbers push in one direction. If you're looking at us being the agents involved, it changes our viewpoint. And you will do this again unconsciously. Okay, a couple of things to wrap up. Well, maybe we avoid thinking altogether, because what we can do is go to Google. AI is going to save us. So what do? We put in the questions to Google and we say, are cats better than dogs? Or are dogs better than cats? And to me, the answer is obvious, right? I have to read this to you, but it says, if you put in cats, are cats better than dogs? It says that cats are lower maintenance and generally easier to deal with. If you put in dogs, it says, in many people's opinions, dogs are better pets than cats. That is, AI is primed by people. It will ascertain what you're looking for and give you the answer that you're seeking. So the web is not neutral. So, sorry, very little way around this. Okay. As I get towards the end, I want to tell you a story about Marquette. So I arrived at Marquette in 1995, and I had an intro class, and in the intro class I had a tall black student. And I said to that student, "Oh, are you in the basketball team?" Yeah. At the time, it seemed okay to say that because the only black, tall male students on campus were in fact athletes. I cannot imagine how insulting, how corrupting that simple question would have been if you'd heard it. But it just slipped out. It seemed automatic and it seemed natural to me. And so, what's the response to that? I think the response is this, that we all have super fast brains that work super well. And we have to in order to live within society. We have to make snap decisions. We make quick perceptions. But just like me and the basketball player, maybe there are some times that it's worth having our super fast brains just slow down a bit. And that's the solution I want to give you for today. So, yes, I'm now open for questions.
Yes. The your point about anger, solicitation, with the recent Supreme Court raised, people were just angry at the ads, both candidates, just couldn't wait for them to end, and I think there's a limit as to what you can do with anger.
Indeed, yes. The question is about anger and the negative ads, and part of that is in fact making you angry makes you more receptive. I was sick for a while and I watched TV and I saw David Gruber ads.
Oh, yeah.
A lot. Didn't like them, didn't appreciate them, but at the same time, if I can make you angry or happy, you are going to be much more receptive to things that I say. If I start with a joke, great, it puts you in an elevated mood state. If I anger you, you are going to be more receptive. So some of this, even though it upsets you, is more effective at delivering its message. Sorry, folks. Yeah?
Thanks, Kevin. As a former artillery officer, I didn't know that you were an infantry officer.
Yeah.
And as you're doing this thinking, have you thought about, the situations in combat where, a lot of infantry soldiers will never fire their weapon in combat because they have this aversion, but then others will. Maybe, is it because they're feeling threatened, or just have you thought about this in combat?
Well, I haven't really, so to answer your question, but that's what basic training is supposed to do, right? You take away the higher faculties, get people working on their lizard brains, so that when I tell you to do something, when I tell you to jump out of a plane, you're not going to think about it, you're just going to react. It's not always good, it may be appropriate in some situations, but yeah. I was a very bad soldier. I mean, my sense of whimsy did not go down well.
Yeah, just following up on that, and the movie Platoon,
Yes.
it showed how these guys were so angry because their buddies had been booby trapped or something, so they just go into these villages and they just start killing
Yes.
the old men and so on. So that would be an example of anger causing them to do something extremely stupid.
Yeah, absolutely. So the point there is that if we get you to a heightened emotional state, we switch off the frontal lobes.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's bad. Yeah. Yes?
I do investing for everybody I'm related to because I do not respond to that loss thing. And of course, for anybody who invests, when the stock market plunges, that's when you should buy, not sell. But I'm wondering, and my relatives all panic and to me, you've got to sell. Is there any way to help flip the way people perceive that?
Yes, I'm going to say yes, but long-term therapy. If you get a bunch of investment managers and they make a loss, they will attribute that loss to bad luck. Because my decisions are good, it was just a bad roll of the dice or something. So you have a personal favorable consideration, but that's not really answering your question. The question is, can we get people out of old grooves of thinking? And no, not easily. Some of us are old enough to remember records, LPs. They have grooves in them. The thing about behavior is that we like to feel comfortable in our behavior, even if we know it is not the best behavior. So, an easy instance might be a yard sale, where you go to a yard sale and you know you're supposed to haggle, you know that's not the most effective way to conduct a bargaining situation. But you know the moves, you know the script, you know the emotion, and that's what you will default to. So just like old grooves, people will default to their behaviors, even if they know it's not the most productive, because they're emotionally tied to that way of thinking. So yes, long-term therapy, you have another employment opportunity in the future. Yeah.
I'm curious if you could speak a little more to the slowing down. So obviously slowing down, maybe think through some of the things that to make a decision. But I can also see in a lot of the examples you get that slowing down can almost lead to like paralysis of like going in circles. Well, maybe this decision is better than that one. Could you speak more to how the slowing down helps without getting into that same group?
You are talking to a professional philosopher. Clearly, at some point, you have to make a decision. But the reason I gave you my basketball example is that it's so easy just to do these snap things. Let's see. Barbara, I'm going to see that? Okay. Give me a number between 1 and 4.
3.
What number did I say, Barbara?
3.
Okay. I mean, there's a trick to that because between excludes the end, and then you've got 2 and 3. We have a bias towards odd numbers. I predicted that you'd do it. Yeah, I mean, it's really just a self-consciousness, I think, that we have to import into this, or seeing us, I like the notion of a medieval jester, where the jester is just on your shoulder saying, maybe we ought to think about this before, acting immediately. One more question, perhaps. Yeah.
Many of us feel obviously we're in a crisis period as far as disinformation and propaganda and its power as groups going way back advertising is built on. A lot of these assumptions that people are not rational, advertising and propaganda. You've obviously been reading into the research, Canada and so on. Do you find any insights for what to do about the bigger problem we're having? Or do you even perceive this as a problem that disinformation and just powerful manipulative propaganda is dominating the detriment of our society?
How would we put that? Is there a way out of our malaise of misinformation?
Any insights from the research?
Wouldn't it be nice if AI did it for us? I don't know. I wish I could give you an answer. I mean, awareness helps. Awareness that we fall into these traps certainly helps. Awareness that people may malign us by doing this sort of thing. And gosh, advertisers found that most people think a giant quart is bigger than a regular quart. It's not. Gosh, I don't know. I mean, I will get political. I used to teach critical thinking. I would relabel it now as something else. But I think importing these skills of critically assessing things into the schools and into colleges is absolutely vital. So maybe I'll hang my hat on that and say thank you very much, everyone, for a lovely